I'm Hannah Moore, CFP, a practicing financial planner and educator. I'm on a mission to change the way people think and talk about money. Let's get started. I believe that financial planning can change family trees. Now, I know that's a big claim, but let me tell you what I mean. Well, first of all, let me tell you what I don't mean. I don't mean that the goal is just to amass millions and millions of dollars that you can pass down, which certainly that does happen, and that does have an impact on future generations. I don't want to minimize that. But when I think about the impact of financial planning has on generations, I think about one client that I had in particular. Now, she was late 60s by the time of the story, and she was just incredibly insightful. I remember watching her make some really difficult transitions, financial transitions and life transitions, but navigating them so well. And so I asked her if I could just come over to her house one day and just interview her and talk to her about why did she navigate these changes so well? What was it uniquely about her? Because I see a lot of clients navigating change, but she did it so gracefully and intentionally. And so I went over there and I got to interview her and just talk to her about her perspective and life and how her money intersected with that. It was such a gift. Oh my gosh, I am so incredibly grateful for that. Now, let me tell you, when I started asking her some questions about this, she started talking about how her grandmother lived and how her grandmother viewed money. And for her story was that she saw her grandmother always needing somebody else. She was never able to take care of anything financial on her own. She would see her parents step in. Her grandmother didn't know how to do really anything. It was this thing that it was, and again, this is generational, but it was her husband's job. And then it was her kid's job to take care of her. And she learned that from her grandmother. And she talked about how that's impacted her. She talked about several stories that she saw as a little girl when she would go to her grandmother's house, and just these subtle things, but it formed how she thought about money and how she viewed money. It impacted her relationships. She talked about how this view changed how she viewed herself in her marriage, how she viewed how they handled money. And so what was so powerful is she started talking about working with us and how it shifted her perspective of where she didn't want to be helpless. She realized that she wanted to be able to take control of her finances. She wanted to have a different story. And what's so cool is that she had granddaughters of her own. And so she started talking about the lessons that she hopes that her granddaughters will have learned from her, where I learned from my grandmother that I wasn't capable of managing money on my own, that it was too complicated for me, that it wasn't my role. And she took ownership of these stories and switched the narrative for herself of saying, you know what, I can. And what's so cool is we worked on building a financial plan for her. We did this, and there's ebbs and flows of all of this. But we worked with her on just basic concepts of how to do a budget, right? She used to send in these one-page sheets where she would map out where she spent her money. Now, I promise you, we don't do that with all clients, but that's what she needed at that time. And so, but we really worked with her to make sure she understood what was happening with her money, made sure that she could make those best decisions for herself. And she embraced that. She changed the narrative of money in her family. She changed the narrative of what it meant to be a woman and managing money in her family. And so then she talks about, what does she want to teach her grandchildren? How does she want her grandchildren to remember her? And she does not want her grandchildren to remember her as somebody who was dependent on everyone else around her to make the decisions for her. She wants her grandchildren to know that they can have control of their finances, that they can be in the driver's seat of their financial lives, that they can be the ones helping them that they can have their life telling their money what they need it to do rather than their money driving them, rather than somebody else making these decisions for them. And so when we look at that from a family tree perspective, you look up 2 generations and down 2 generations. It's one of the most impactful stories that I've heard directly from a client of really tying these pieces together. At the beginning of this podcast, you heard me say that I'm on a mission to change the way people think and talk about money. I look at how is money talked about in our country? How is money talked about in your families, right? And it ranges so dramatically. And oftentimes there's good reason for this, right? It is not a bad thing to have somebody help you make financial decisions. It is not a bad thing to get help, to do all these things. But it becomes when that becomes your narrative, that becomes who you are, right? And it becomes, what is it? This idea of flipping the script. One of my favorite questions to ask clients is, how do you want your kids to think about? What are the money values that you want to pass on to your kids? What are the things that you want your kids to live by when it comes to money? And oftentimes for me, I even struggle with this because it's so tied to so many of the things I struggle with, right? Like, where do you get your worth? Are you valued just because of the amount of salary that you have, that you take home? Are you valued because of your retirement accounts, or are you valued for something else? When we look at money, money is just intertwined with absolutely everything. And so when we look at changing this narrative, it's so incredibly powerful because it can change our perspective. And when it changes our perspective, it changes everything, right? Having a client come into my office and talk about how they know their financial plan isn't going to work, they know they don't have enough money, they know blah, 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 all these things. It's an entirely different conversation than somebody who comes in and says, let's discover what's possible together around my money. 2 totally night and day conversations. And it impacts people around you. It impacts, your kids are watching you, your grandkids are watching, your siblings. I don't know what your family structure is. Your friends are watching you, right? And the more that you can step into, like, what is possible with their money? What would it look like if I wasn't afraid of money anymore? What would that look like? What would change for me? Those are the questions that I think can be so incredibly powerful and transformational in our story around money. I was working with a client recently where they have nothing saved. They are starting really basically from zero of looking at, and they're not in their 20s, right? They're a couple decades past that, and they're just getting started on their financial, they have been living their financial lives, but really getting started on, okay, how are we going to save for retirement? What is this going to look like? And one of the things that I kept going back to whenever I think about them is when they didn't have a vision for what their money could do for them. They didn't have a vision of what was possible with their money. Now, by them shifting their mindset, by them shifting their perspective just a little bit, it changes everything. They've even talked about it. They talked about how their kids are scared to ask them for things. They're scared to ask for the concert tickets. They're, for their parents to attend the awards dinner, things like this, because they know they don't have money. Right? It's this shifting perspective of, okay, so what if they had a vision for what was possible with their money? How is that going to change? It's going to change how their kids view their money. It's going to change how their kids view what is possible. And yes, it's a great thing to be able to leave money to your kids. Absolutely. Hands down, right? I think most people agree with that. I mean, certainly there's exceptions and there's always outliers. But in general, when I think about the value that we give to our kids, when we talk about changing generations around financial planning, a lot of it comes down to how do we think and talk about money? Just like my client, she's shifting the narrative in her family. And it's not necessarily the most, brazen thing out there, but it's subtle and it's powerful. And the impact that my client is going to have on her family, I mean, it's profound. And we've been fortunate enough to work with this family, and we've seen it in other places, but it truly is profound. So I want to encourage you that start making these little shifts. Start asking yourself these questions of what is possible. What is a view that I have around money, right? What if I shifted it? What if I said, I'm not good at money yet? What if we changed the narrative of how we view money? Because if we do that, it's going to change. I firmly believe it'll change your life. It'll change the outlook of your life. But I also believe that will continue to change your family tree. The people around you, the people that you care about the most, will be able to see this and experience a difference. And that to me makes it absolutely worth it. Thanks for listening to this episode of Everyday Money with Hannah Moore. If you like what you heard, subscribe and check out livewealthynow.com. We have a lot more resources to help you live wealthy now.